Welcome to Watchtower History. All right, so now we're going to look at the protocols of the elders of Zion a little bit more.
So Jeff, in summary of that, this is what it's all about, and this is what started it all. So
yeah.
So here we are. Let's let the viewer know. Here we are. This is what it indirectly, sort of, kind of, more probably, this is what the religion is right here. The mindset that came out.
When we started looking at this, we were noticing some similarities. It's like when I found Ford's book and I started seeing all these little details. Like, oh, that's like Rutherford. That's like Rutherford. That's like Rutherford. And I couldn't get the whole picture. And all of a sudden, all Paul's hearing is all these different little points that I'm bringing out. And he's not looking at all the little slides that I'm sending or all the information. He's just hearing me repeat these stories. And he keeps hearing the same thing. Until he realizes
all the things that we are finding, and a lot of it with Jeff's research, most of it, and a little help from others, is the common denominator is he built a religion out of all the research that we're finding, all where it originated. He literally built a religion from anti-Semitism. And little by little, he tried to make scriptures work in order to do that. Even the Jews rejected Jesus at some point. So did he. He removed him from the picture, made Jehovah. He became Jesus. He became the Savior. You got to go through his organization. And Jeff was looking at a lot of the stuff from this point of view, and I'm stepping back because I'm not really looking at all the slides he's sending me. I'm just glancing at them and listening. Most of it the actual idea came on a phone conversation, and I just blurted it out. He built a religion on the ideas that all these people are anti-Semitism.
He's basically taking what he had learned from the populist movement, William Jennings Bryan, the conspiracies that they were publishing, those forgeries. We know that he even saved some of those letters for 30 years and published them in his book Vindication.
And not to interrupt you, Jeff, but that's getting to what you just said. As we're researching with that thought in mind, we're finding a trail of evidence. And that was one of the clinchers. Here he is saving letters. What letters are you saving for 30 years ago? Oh, the ones that don't have proof. And it's matching with what other anti-Semitic people are doing.
So when he said, that's what Rutherford did, he built a religion out of his anti-Semitism. He built a religion out of those conspiracies. And I had to sit back and think, oh, that makes so much sense, because it ties into his politics. It ties into his anti-Semitism. All of those little things that never made any sense. Where did his anti-Semitic rhetoric come from? Where did that come from? And you start seeing all these little threads, and everything weaves into a nice little tapestry.
And before we went and did a deep delve into this, we did a conference call with Jim Penton. And
not only with Jim Penton, but with also some other professors of history, because we wanted
experts on Ford.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure, absolutely certain, that we were historically accurate.
Everyone was amazed and said, wow, yeah, that makes sense. That seems, you guys are on the right track. That's what he did. And then we called Penton after we got that. Then we called Penton, and Jim, we ran that by him, and basically he said, like Jeff said, he was thunderstruck at the idea. And wow, that's what it had.
Wow, look at this. This is tremendous. This is outstanding because it shows Rutherford's background, and it's also touching a number of other people. I am thunderstruck by some of the things you're telling me. But when you point these things out, it makes the best sense in the world. This is such a powerful thing because it deals with the Watchtower Society, not only him, but others with him, and the connection to Henry Ford, who was so terribly anti-Semitic. I am just very, very enthused about this because this is just the sort of historical research that I love to see coming out.
Yes, Jim said that he was thunderstruck. He said it all made sense, except he had one question. A very important question. He asked, how could Rutherford be pro-Zionist, writing Comfort for the Jews, for example, visiting Palestine, and at the same time hold these anti-Semitic views? Very important question. And the answer was simply, Rutherford was doing what a lot of the others had been doing. They were separating in their minds the religious Jew from the commercial Jew, the banker Jew, the business Jew, the international Jew. And then we see that other Christians are doing the same thing. Pat Robertson, saying very anti-Semitic things, yet at the same time doing a lot of things for Israel, because they're making a difference between the religious Jew and the conspiratorial Jew, the Jew that's plotting to take over the world. And so when we start seeing that, Rutherford, in his lecture to the Jews, is giving forth some of these conspiracies to the Jews, you wonder why the Jews weren't listening to his message? It's because of those things like that. So when we mentioned that to Penton, he realized, yeah, that makes perfect sense, because it literally answers everything. He didn't automatically become anti-Semitic. He had been anti-Semitic since his early political days, from the populist movement. That's why he's saving papers from the populist movement for decades, and then using that to build the new theories behind the new religion that he's building in that replacement theology.
And what we wanted to show is it's not just Rutherford doing it. It's other people creating this whole conspiracy of the Jews trying to take over the world. And again, one created a financial aspect from it, another created a religious. That was Rutherford, the religious. Others like Ford, it was a pure financial.
They are not laughing at you, Henry Ford. I've read the papers too.
Yeah, well, they're calling me God's fool.
What about the ones praising you for trying? The hero of a small man standing against the world for his principles?
Yeah. Clara, it's not that I want anything that money can buy. I don't care about any material thing. All I want is an end to this damn war, and I want peace in the world, and I'd like to leave the world a little bit better off for my having been here, that's all.
You have. Look how successful you've been.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't know it by the newspapers. All they're doing is ridiculing me all the time. And you know who they are.
No.
Well, you do. The same people I've been fighting all this time. Wall Street brokers, those fat cats, rich bankers, munition makers. You know who they all are?
No.
They're Jews, most of them.
Henry!
Well, they are, most of them.
I won't listen
well,
to
I'm
that
sorry,
talk.
they are,
That's
Clara.
not right.
Well, I'm sorry. They are. And it's a damn conspiracy, too. And it's all there in that Protocols of the Elders of Zion thing. It's all there. It's a conspiracy. Well, if they think I have lived all my lives to get to where I am, to be brought down by a bunch of tricksters, they're wrong. Wrong!
So this is where we wound up. And that's why we took the depth of time to go through and show a lot of documentation from a lot of sources and different people, including throwing in Bryant, Ford, many others. And this is what we came up with.
And so now where we're at in our research is, where did Ford get it from? And he's mentioning these are coming from the Russians, right? The protocols originate from a Russian source. So now we're going to take a look at and try to fact check the Russian sources and see what we can find. As stated before, these protocols keep updating and changing over time, depending who's spreading them. The protocol suggested it was only about the Jews, but then it became the Jewish, Bolshevik, Communist, Bibelforscher, Masonic conspiracy to dominate and rule the world. There's a interesting chapter in Professor Baldwin's Henry Ford and the Jews that's titled, "I Am Not a Jew Hater." Among Henry Ford's private papers, formally dedicated at his Fair Lane estate in Dearborn on May 7, 1953, as part of the Ford Motor Company archives, were found hundreds of pocket-sized reminder books containing accumulated jottings spanning more than a half a century. On the perforated pages were intermingled names and addresses Ford wanted to remember, song titles to be included in the repertory of the next folk dancing get-together at Greenfield Village, catchphrases and handy quotes Ford invented or came upon in his reading, as well as asserted prejudices and fixed ideas, disappointments, and frustrations. This last category was predominantly in evidence in notebooks from the 1930s Depression years, where, according to a New York Times reporter, permitted an early look at the uncatalogued material. The private jottings reflected Ford's dislike of bankers, Jews, the New Deal, and labor unions, and his major competitors, General Motors and Chrysler. Occasionally, Ford merged these components together into an imagined conspiracy against the Ford Motor Company, losing ground in a competitive consumer marketplace. Ford said, "Our competitors are behind all tax and NRA, the National Recovery Administration, plans with the Bankers International, and they are running all the governments in the world. Ford Free Associated. Unions are created by finance and industry." In another place, he scrawled, as if reminding himself, "The Jew is out to enslave you." In Cohn's warrant for genocide, it asked the question of Ford, did he himself believe? At first sight, it seems incredible that a man who could build up a huge industrial empire from scratch could be as naive as that. Yet some of the things Ford did can be explained in no other way. When the International Jew began to make its impact, a prominent American Jew, Isaac Landman, offered to provide enough money to enable the world's leading detectives to establish once and for all whether a secret Jewish government did or did not exist. Whatever the results might be, they were to be printed in at least 100 leading newspapers. Ford rejected the offer. But instead of leaving the matter at that, he himself put a squad of agents into New York to unmask the operations of the secret government. These agents, some of them fanatics and others mere crooks, shadowed prominent Jews, investigated such improbable bodies as the shipping board, and above all, carried on a melodramatic correspondence with headquarters at Detroit, using code names as signatures. In the end, they heard of the official New York Jewish Community Organization, which under the name Kahila, Yiddish for Kahal, or Cabal, was chiefly concerned with protecting and educating Jewish immigrants. This, they announced, was the secret government in whose hand President Wilson, Herbert Hoover, and Colonel House were willing tools. That Ford lent himself to such a performance strongly suggests that in this matter at least he was no cynic, but a true believer. Just like Rutherford himself was a true believer in what he was teaching and sharing from these ideas. And one can see what could have made him so. Paradoxically, this man who did so much to create the modern world of mass production and cheap travel detested modernity. He abominated cities, especially New York, and was convinced that the only true Americans were those in the farms and small towns of the Middle West. He cherished a sentimental nostalgia for the pre-industrial past. We have seen how easily such attitudes can lead to the more virulent form of political anti-Semitism. Moreover, Ford had absolutely no understanding of the complex ways in which societies operate and history is made. All the world needs for the guidance of his life could be written on 2 pages of a child's copybook, he wrote in the Dearborn Independent. A man who could believe that could also believe that all the transformations and upheavals and torments of the modern world have a single explanation, enshrined in the few dozen pages of the protocols. All in all, the protocols probably owe their most influential backing less to Ford's Machiavellianism than to his astounding innocence. And remember, when Ford is put on the stand with the Chicago Tribune trial, they questioned him on his knowledge of history and society around him, and he failed miserably.
In early summer 1919, Henry Ford arrived at the courthouse in Mount Clemens, Michigan, a small town north of Detroit. Ford had sued the Chicago Tribune for libel after the paper called him an ignorant idealist and an anarchist enemy of the nation. Now, he would take the stand. To disprove the allegation of libel, the Tribune set out to prove Ford's ignorance. "Do you know anything about the Revolution, Mr. Ford?" the Tribune's lawyer asked. "Yes, sir," Ford replied. "What revolution did you have in mind, Mr. Ford?" "In 1812, Ford answered, to the amazement of the people in the courtroom.
They basically asked him, you might say, high school questions. And he was revealed to be pathetically inarticulate and ill-informed. The stuff he didn't know was amazing to people.
"Don't you know there was not any revolution in 1812? The lawyer persisted. "Don't you know that this country was born out of a revolution in 1776? Did you forget that?" "I guess I did," Ford answered.
The defense attorneys want to paint him as someone who is semi-literate. They ask him to read passages, and he refuses. The first day he says that he forgot his glasses. The next day he said that he can't read because his eyes are watery. And he comes across as being out of his depth.
Newspapers from across the country covered the trial in breathless detail, as Ford was subjected to 8 days of questioning.
He hates lawyers, just as he hates Wall Street. And he can't get off the stand. He can't just get up and say, I don't have to take this, I'm Henry Ford. No, sir, you are under oath.
When the trial finally concluded, the jury, made up mostly of farmers, found that Ford had indeed been libeled. He may have been ignorant, but he was no anarchist. But despite the victory, Ford was deeply wounded by the experience. The press, in particular, heaped ridicule on the automaker for his embarrassing performance.
For everyone who was there, particularly newspaper reporters, what this seemed to clinch was their suspicion that Henry Ford was a rural rube who had stumbled into his success. A stupid man representing stupid ideas and stupid people.
Mr. Ford, wrote the New York Times, has been submitted to a severe examination of his intellectual qualities. He has not received a pass. The New York Post put it even more harshly. The man is a joke.
This is an interesting question to ask about Ford. Did he really believe it? The same question can be asked about Judge Rutherford. Did Rutherford believe these things? I'm beginning to be of the opinion that he did, and he mixed his own ideas into it, just like Ford did. As I said earlier, he's bringing a lot of his Baptist theology into the mix regarding this Antichrist and this one world government. Instead of placing it completely in the past, as Russell had done, he's starting down this path of identifying himself in the Watchtower Society and all of these prophecies after 1914. And so he's kind of putting it at the time that he's in. So if there's an Antichrist government that's going to take over the world, and the Jehovah's Witnesses should expect to be persecuted, and if we're persecuted, it proves we're the chosen ones. And if we're the chosen ones, it means we're chosen from the time before the prophecies were written, because the prophecies are all about us. And if there's going to be a one world government like that, then we need to look at all the conspiracies and all the things around that might help prove to us that it's happening right now. And because of his association with the populist parties, Jewish and Rothschild conspiracies, when he campaigned for William Jennings Bryan, Rutherford incorporates this into his new thinking, into his new theology. He's bringing his old anti-Semitic ideas from the populist movement and Bryan and bringing it into Watchtower and creating a whole new theology, a whole new doctrine, a whole new prophetic scheme out of his politics and out of these conspiracies. So the Protocols finds a home. And this is a book, a rumor about the Jews, conspiracy, anti-Semitism, and the Protocols of Zion by Stephen Eric Bronner. He says, anti-Semitism was nowhere stronger than in Russia. Not only the most economically underdeveloped among what were known as the great powers, it was also the most politically and culturally retrograde. Russia's literary tradition, which included giants like Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Chekhov, illuminated the empire's problems with striking clarity. But its aristocrats and huge peasantry were suspicious of liberal ideals and Western individualism. So let's go down a little bit more. Russia's was a perfect setting for the publication of the Protocols. It first appeared in 1903, immediately inspiring the pogrom in Kishinev, Bessarabia, which left 49 Jews dead and 600 raped or wounded. And this was passed along by Golovinsky's associates. The tract was initially published in a Russian paper called The Banner, a newspaper in St. Petersburg owned by a well-known anti-Semite, P.A. Khrushchevan, who was among the pogrom's principal instigators. So this was organized during the reign of Tsar Alexander III. And this group anticipated Mussolini's black shirts and the notorious brown shirts of the Nazis and the stormtroopers. It was supported by certain aristocrats and high government bureaucrats, especially in the cities. However, criminals and ruffians predominated in the Black Hundreds. This organization would turn the Protocols into its manifesto.
Now remember, this Russia that we're talking about right now was basically in the same situation that Hitler's Germany was in at the time. The same mentality, the same economy, a lot basically identical similarities. Okay? How do you blame something on somebody? So what's the cause of all your problems and how do you get rid of them?
It's just like the Nazis did. They blamed all their problems on the Jews. And so the Russians were doing the same thing. And the Germans are going to look at the Russian protocols, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, and see what their opinion about it was. In Russia, there was a gentleman named Sergei Nilis, who included this 1905 text into an appendix in the second edition of his 1903 book that he printed later on. And the book was called The Great in the Small, The Coming of the Antichrist and the Rule of Satan on Earth. The Jews were always seen as the Antichrist because they rejected Christ. And this is a novel in which he tells of his conversion from a worldly intellectual into a religious mystic. He republished it again in an expanded edition in 1917 entitled It is Near at Our Doors, warning of a second apocalypse initiated by the Jews. Knowledge about the life of Sergei Nilis is even more sketchy than knowledge about the origins of the protocols. All right, so, and Sergei Nilis's book ended up in the Tsar's library. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. And so when the Russian Bolshevik Revolution happened in 1917, there are several who escaped Russia, and they took this book with them into other lands. And then when they got to the other lands, they were translated it under languages and republished. And this is how it got into the hands of Ford. And then Ford and the International Jew republished it, and it got into the hands of the Nazis and millions of people who bought Ford vehicles. And each time it gets translated or gets, republished, the story keeps changing, and they keep adding to it and removing it and throwing things in. Every time the culture changes, they throw in something new into the culture. So remember, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, this book is starting to get spread around all over the world, and it's getting translated into multiple languages. Now, the London Times did an investigation. And in that investigation, they realized it's a fake. It was a forgery. Just like Rutherford's Rothschild letters he published in his Vindication were forgeries as well. Well, how can you know something's a forgery? Like Ford said, let them prove it's a fake instead of him proving it's real, right? And so the London Times, August 17th, 1921, and there was a series of articles, publishes these protocols with one of the original sources that it came from. Now, the Russians were not very clever. What they did is there's a German source and a French source. And instead of rewriting it, they almost copied it verbatim. There was a satire written about Napoleon III called Machiavelli in the Depths of Hell. And what they did was, basically, it was like they had a text in a computer, and they did a search and replace and found Napoleon III and replaced with the word Jews. So everything that said about Napoleon III became something about the Jews. This Machiavelli book was published in 1865. And so what the London Times did was they laid them out in columns. And so they put in one column these dialogues, and they put in the second column the protocols.
And again, this is in 1921 after the event, and while Rutherford is doing his Protocols of Zion himself.
There was actually a good book on this by Will Eisner, The Plot, The Secret Story of the Protocols of the Elder of Zion. And he goes into a lot of the history of this that all is very well documented. But I like how he lays out the dialogue in hell with the protocols in columns. The first dialogue and the protocol number 1. And he takes through and shows the parallels between each of these and how identical they are. At least if you're going to put forth a forgery, don't make it so obvious that you've copied it from another source.
Well,
right?
Jeff, remember during that time, they couldn't get on the internet and look something up. Traveling, the average person lived on their farm, wouldn't travel to go see this stuff. So they were very confident to get away with it. In fact, they were so confident that they'd get away with it. Obviously, they got away with it.
Yeah.
So the time dictated that factor. It's only in our time frame in life that we can fact check and go back and research what went wrong with what they did.
We talked about Russia. Was this originated in Russia, how it escaped, how it fled into other countries, how it was translated into other languages, and it keeps changing and evolving as it goes from one language or one country to another, or as it goes from one period of time to another. Each decade keeps seeing changes through it. They keep adding things to it. So when you go back and try and fact check those various things, none of them are checking out. So already know that the congressional record always denied it was true. Henry Ford didn't want to try and prove it was true and said, let them prove it. And we saw it's based in a forgery.
And when he got in his car wreck that he was too injured to go to trial to defend it.
He had to admit, let's shut down the Dearborn Independent and apologize. But then, did he really not believe it? Of course, he accepted the medal from Hitler. And Hitler, in Mein Kampf, said he got the idea from Henry Ford. And so back to the Russian story. There's a book, Holocaust to History, by Deborah Dvorak and Robert Jan von Pelt. So they're going to talk a little bit about the Russian origin. Extreme right-wing political organizations then seized on a longer rendition of the conspiracy theory. Again, as we said, it keeps getting modified as it keeps traveling through history. The so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a whole cloth fabrication, the protocols claim to be the leaked minutes of a secret meeting of senior Jewish leaders at the First Zionist Congress convened by Theodor Herzl in 1897. We've already talked about that. Indeed, according to the protocols, the Congress itself had been a front for the Jews to discuss their machinations to control the world. First published in installments in the St. Petersburg newspaper in 1903, the protocols appeared in book form 2 years later and was subsequently reworked by the mystical writer Sergei Nilis. Remember, we were talking about Nilis before. He wrote this book. He tied the conspiracy of the Council of Elders to the coming of the Antichrist, making it a Jewish Antichrist. So if you're the kind of Christian that believes, the Antichrist must come out of Judaism, and you find a conspiracy that says the Antichrist is coming out of Judaism, kind of probably pretty easy to accept the kind of thing that you're already looking for. So Nilis' version deeply impressed Tsar Nicholas II, who decorated members of Russia's secret police for their discovery of the documents. But when ultra-conservative politicians sought government permission to make the protocols the centerpiece of a large-scale anti-Semitic campaign, Minister of Interior Pyotr Stolypin withheld approval pending an investigation of the origin of the text. Remember, these protocols are originating from Russia. So now the Russians are trying to investigate what the origin are. The inquiry exposed the protocols as a sheer invention. Drop the protocols, the Tsar commanded Stolypin. One cannot defend a pure cause by dirty methods. The Tsar, however, did not see that the facts were made public, and the protocols went on to have a long and tragically effective life. Because remember, after the Bolshevik Revolution, it left Russia and got into Watchtower theology.
Basically, yes.
Basically. All right, so the footnote from the previous book leads to this one. Norman Cohn's Warrant for Genocide, the myth of the Jewish world conspiracy, and the protocols of the Elder of Zion. So it must be borne in mind that these matters, everything depended on the attitude of the Tsar himself. And in the end, the Tsar, however besotted by the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, had to recognize the protocols as spurious. How this came about is described in a statement from General K.I. Globachev, one-time commandant of the St. Petersburg Division of the Okhrana. I guess that's like the KGB, which Bustev produced at the Bern trial. So they actually had a trial about this. Globachev describes how after many unsuccessful attempts, the protocols were at last brought to the Tsar's notice in the revolutionary year 1905. Regarding the protocols, he continues, and this is from the court record. He said, it made a very deep impression on Nicholas II, who made them his handbook for politics. Typical in this respect are the marginal annotations which Nicholas II made on the copy of the protocols which had been submitted to him. What depth of thought, what foresight, what precision in the realization of the program. Our year 1905 has gone through, managed by the elders. There could be no doubt as to their authenticity. Everywhere one sees the directing and destroying hand of Judaism, and so on. Keenly interested in the discovery of the protocols, Nicholas II gave his attention to the foreign branch of the Russian secret police and handed out a great number of rewards, decorations, and gratuities. The leaders of the Union of the Russian People, like Shamkov, Markov II, etc., addressed a request to the Ministry of the Interior asking for authorization to use the protocols on a large scale in the struggle against militant Judaism and for subsidies for the purpose. But the Minister of the Interior, Stolypin, entrusted 2 officers of the Corps, Martov and Valyasov, with a secret inquiry into the origin of the protocols. This inquiry revealed clearly the spuriousness of the protocols. The results of the inquiry were presented to Nicholas II, who was completely bowled over. And this is the resolution of Nicholas II on the report concerning the employment of the protocols for anti-Semitic propaganda. The Tsar said, "Drop the protocols. One cannot defend a pure cause by dirty methods." In 1917 and 1918, when the Tsar was overthrown, and after the Tsar and his family were found, they were assassinated and killed, they found 3 books are in their possession. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, because every good Russian needs War and Peace. The Holy Bible, and this book that had the appendix of the Protocols of Zion. So here's the Russian source from the person who worked with the Tsar and had the Tsar's opinion. And this was published in Paris in Russian in 1938. And this is what they said. The protocols were drawn up in the period 1896 to 1900, compiled in Paris by one of the agents of the Russian political police who wanted to distinguish himself in this. They were sent, in addition to their direct superiors in Paris, to St. Petersburg Regiment. The letter passed them on to Jean Baron Grothmus, playing a role in the Nazi movement in Germany, is getting passed around. All attempts by Grotius in the period 1901 to 2 to interest him in the environment of Emperor Nicholas II and himself were not successful. The assistants of Antisemitic, who did not believe in the authenticity of the protocols and carried them out for personal reasons, didn't help either. Thus, the case with the protocols stalled. They were destined to sail again in the revolution in 1905. They were promoted by Trepov, who received them from a general. Regarding the protocols, it made a very strong impression on Nicholas II. From that moment, made them as if it were his political guide. Characteristic are the notes he made in the margins of the copy provided to him. And here's those statements: what depth of thought, what foresight. There can be no doubt. But interested in receiving the protocols, Nicholas II turned his attention to foreign agents and awarded many with orders and cash awards. Again, this is sounding very, very similar to the other accounts that we've read. This is their Russian source. Affairs permission to widely use the protocols to combat militant Jewry. So under pressure from Lupkin, Stolypin ordered a secret investigation into their origin. The inquiry established absolutely the forgery of the protocols and their authors. This is when Nicholas II said, "Remove it. It's impossible to defend a pure cause with dirty methods."
The document is so powerful, in fact, that although the Protocols has been proven to be a hoax on at least 10 different occasions during its 100-year history, many people who read it still believe the document is real and the words in it are true. Who could create such a powerful deception? And why was the Protocols created in the first place? St. Petersburg, Russia is ground zero for the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. And to understand how and why the protocols came to exist, you have to examine what is happening in Russia at the time the fake document is created in 1897. It is the eve of the Russian Revolution.
It was an age of crisis. In times of crisis, people need some sort of explanation for what's going on. And that's, of course, one of the things about the Jewish world conspiracies, that nothing that's going on in the modern world cannot be explained by the sinister nature of what the Jews are up to.
Within the government, Tsar Nicholas II is torn between two opposing factions. The liberal reformers want to establish a political dialogue with the Bolsheviks, the leaders of the burgeoning revolution. The conservative right is strongly opposed and begins a secret campaign to discredit the liberals. Since many of the Tsar's liberal ministers and their Bolshevik counterparts are Jews or have strong ties to Jewish business interests, creation of the protocols provides a convenient yet imaginary reason to fear the left.
It was never meant to be harmless. It always had a political purpose, and I think a destructive political purpose in almost every case. Perhaps at the origins, the very origins, it had nothing more to it than an attempt to influence the sort of minor personnel decisions of the Tsar, Nicholas II, the weak-willed Nicholas II. Some have theorized that it was trying to put some spine into him, that he should come down hard on his enemies like the elders of Zion would if they were in his place.
No one knows for certain, but the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests that the protocols of the learned elders of Zion is created by the Okhrana, the Russian secret police. A right-wing faction controls the Okhrana, a group that has the will and the means to create a persuasive forgery.
The person overseeing it for the Russian Okhrana commissioned other such works to discredit political enemies or political threats.
That person is Pyotr Ivanovich Rakovsky, who directs the Okhrana foreign offices. He is a master forger who equips his agents with false documents so they can infiltrate subversive organizations and destroy them from within. And most compelling of all, Rakovsky has a history of blaming Jews for everything. In 1892, 5 years before the release of the protocols, Rakovsky uses the pen name Jean Préval and publishes Anarchie et Nihilisme, a small pamphlet outlining the very same ideas that will appear in the protocols 5 years later. In 1897, it seems, he improves on the original by removing the author's name altogether and making his work look exactly like a real document. It is then disseminated to a number of key conservative organizations.
There's a very great allure that the secret document has. If you're in Washington and you want to get the news out, you do a lot better by leaking a secret document than by making your views just directly available. Everybody's interested in a secret. And when it is such a tremendous secret, a secret about plans to take over the world, well, it's irresistible.
The protocols spread slowly but surely in conservative circles. Then, in 1903, there is an explosion. The version of the protocols purportedly authored by Rakovsky is released publicly, published in a St. Petersburg newspaper. The editor is Pavlachi Khrushchevan, an ardent fascist and anti-Semite, whose editorials have just sparked a riot in the Russian city of Kishinev. 45 Jews are killed, and more than 1,300 Jewish homes and shops are destroyed. As soon as Khrushchevan receives the fraudulent protocols of the learned elders of Zion, he publishes it as fact. The evil genie is now out of the bottle.
We will undermine the sources of production by instilling in the workmen ideas of anarchy and encouraging them in the use of alcohol, at the same time taking measures to drive all the intellectual forces of the Gentiles from the land.
They were a confession that did not intend to be a confession. It was what the Jews never would have said in public, but among their own kind, they could make these claims. As a result, it had enormous persuasive effect if you were once willing to grant the fact that this far-fetched forgery was real.
Khrushchev also publishes cheap editions of the protocols in pamphlet form for mass distribution and joins with other militant anti-Semites to form the Union of Russian People, also known as the Black Hundreds. They begin to commit acts of terror and assassination against Jewish liberals and radicals. By scapegoating the Jews, Khrushchev achieves power and fame, and this does not go unnoticed by others seeking the same. And one of these men has the ear of the Tsar. Sergei Nilis is a third-string advisor in the court of Nicholas and Alexandra. He is welcomed at court because he is a celebrity, a Christian mystic who has written The Great in the Small, a best-selling autobiography about his transformation from middle-class atheist to an enlightened spokesman for God. In the first years of the 20th century, many mystics are regular visitors to the court of the Romanovs, but they are all mere shadows compared to the overbearing presence of Rasputin, Tsarina Alexandra's personal spiritual advisor and confidant. Sergei Nilis is desperate to make a name for himself and presents the protocols to the Tsar as a true and authentic document. The protocols make a very deep impression on the Tsar.
What depth of thought, what foresight! Our year 1905 has gone as though managed by the elders. There can be no doubt as to their authenticity.
In 1905, a version of the protocols is published with the imprint of the Imperial Palace. The Orthodox Church in Moscow orders the protocols included in a sermon. On October 16, 1905, parishioners in 368 churches throughout the city of Moscow hear the protocols recited by their priests.
The fact that you have the protocols read in all kinds of Orthodox churches in Russia by their priests, they are integrating now the protocols of the Elders of Zion like if it would be any other text written in antiquity, like the book of Revelation. Now we are in another time of crisis like that, and here is a document which has the validity, which proves what we have been saying over 1800 years, that the Jews are Antichrist people, the armies of Antichrist.
3 weeks after the sermons begin, on November 8, 1905, more than 1,000 Jews are massacred in the Russian city of Odessa. It is a harbinger of atrocities to come.
The reason I'm doing this is because of what I read here, and you have this coming. That is to say, people intelligent enough to read books and sometimes to write books, I think they find the protocols useful and informative and authentic.
As Russia moves ever closer to revolution in the decade before World War I, the political right has finally succeeded in its original intent. The protocols of the learned elders of Zion has demonized the left. It is now politically correct to hate Jews and to denounce socialists and communists as puppets of the worldwide Jewish conspiracy.
It's not surprising that the empirical evidence, that is, the Jewish-sounding names among the Bolshevik leadership, and there were many, Trotsky being the most famous of them, was proof that this was a Jewish conspiracy. And that is, incidentally, what made the protocols believable, I think, right up and through the Holocaust, and maybe beyond the Holocaust. That is to say, the association, the popular association of Jews with the left, and particularly with communism. It was somehow comforting for non-Jews, I guess, to think that this odious worldview, this godless and dangerous and aggressive ideology, was not Christian.
The protocols is so entrenched that when Tsar Nicholas receives the results of an official government inquiry revealing that the protocols is a hoax, no one seems to care. Tsar Nicholas writes, "Drop the protocols. One cannot defend a pure cause by dirty methods." But the damage has already been done. When the Russian government is overthrown by Bolshevik revolutionaries in 1917, the invented prophecy in the protocols seems to come true. Then, on July 16, 1918, the Tsar and his entire family are executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. And what the royal family leaves behind gives the anti-Semites even more justification for their growing reign of terror. Immediately following the assassination of the Russian royal family in the summer of 1918, an officer arrives at the murder scene to conduct an investigation. Among the family's possessions, he claims to discover only 3 books: the Bible, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and The Great in the Small by Sergei Nilus, the appendix of which includes the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this connection between the protocols and the execution of the Romanovs spreads like wildfire among the Tsar's surviving right-wing loyalists.
When the Protocols of the Elders of Zion come up at the passage from Tsarist to Bolshevik Russia, and all kinds of Tsarist and right-wingers are fleeing the country, and where do they go? They try to go in Europe, Germany, France, to these places. And it would not be astonishing that some carry in their luggage not only some souvenirs of their household, but also carry with them a Russian version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which for them is like a new gospel.
In fact, it has taken Russia, the birthplace of the Protocols, almost a century to condemn the document for what it is. In 1993, a Russian court rules that the Protocols are an anti-Semitic forgery. But even this historic proclamation is not enough to stop the hate.
Ford could not admit it was true. The Russians, where it originated from, couldn't admit it was true. The United States Congress couldn't prove it was true.
Is there
But
any other group?
But wait, there's more.
I recently purchased Mein Kampf by Hitler from the U.S. bookstore. And there's a couple of interesting statements Hitler makes. He's talking about what others are seeing going on in the world, and specifically about Henry Ford. Hitler says he already sees the present-day European states as will-less tools in his fist, whether indirectly through a so-called Western democracy or in the form of direct domination by Jewish Bolshevism. But it is not only the old world that he holds thus enmeshed. The same fate menaces the new. It is the Jews who govern the stock exchange forces of the American Union. Every year it makes them more and more the controlling masters of the producers in a nation of 120 millions. Only a single great man, Ford, to their fury, still maintains full independence. And remember, Hitler had Ford's International Jew translated into German. Hitler had Ford's portrait hanging in his office. Ford was one of his heroes. Ford was his idol. Ford influenced Hitler to a great extent. I remember where they're getting their ideas from. Ford, in his Dearborn Independent, through his editor, Cameron, were taking the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and extrapolating and making more out of it. And it's interesting what Hitler says about the Protocols. Hitler says, to what an extent the whole existence of this people is based on a continuous lie is shown incomparably by the Protocols of the wise men of Zion, so infinitely hated by the Jews. They are based on a forgery. Hitler says very, very clearly, they are based on a forgery. The Frankfurter Zeitung moans and screams once every week, the best proof that they are authentic. What many Jews may do unconsciously is here consciously exposed. And that is what matters. It is completely indifferent from what the Jewish brain these disclosures originate. The important thing is that with positively terrifying certainty, they reveal the nature and activity of the Jewish people and expose their inner contexts as well as their ultimate final aims. The best criticism applied to them, however, is reality. Anyone who examines the historical development of the last 100 years from the standpoint of this book will at once understand the screaming of the Jewish press. For once, this book has become the common property of a people. The Jewish menace may be considered as broken. And so, even though Hitler knows they're based on a forgery, He thinks there's enough truth in them that they have to be true. But wait, there's more. So in Goebbels' diaries, he mentions the protocols. And this is also mentioned in the book Joseph Goebbels' Life and Death by Toby Thacker. And the statement Goebbels makes is that
once to emphasize it, not interrupt you, Jeff, but to emphasize this. Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, a Nazi, a number one ranking Nazi underneath Hitler. What did he have to say?
He says, I believe that the protocols of the elders of Zion are a forgery. Not because the worldview or the Jewish aspirations outlined in them are too utopian or fantastical. One sees indeed how one demand from the protocols is linked to another, how a systematic plan to destroy the world and leave it in ruins is laid out. But because I don't believe the Jews are so boundlessly stupid that they would not have kept such important protocols secret, therefore I believe in the inner truth, but not the factual truth of the protocols. Musing further about the problem, he proclaimed his own newly found standpoint. I stand on the Volkitz side. I hate the Jew from instinct and from understanding. I hate him from the depths of my soul. And remember, a little bit further on this book here by Thacker, remember the Nazis' primary source used most often was Ford's International Jew, which reprinted and expanded upon the protocol's forgery. Thacker says in his book, in early April 1924, he read Henry Ford's International Jew. And although he was no natural friend of Ford, whom he identified as the richest man in the world, he was doubly impressed that Ford should see Jewish capitalism as a pernicious influence. Through Ford, Goebbels was introduced to the protocols of the elders of Zion. And so therefore, not only Hitler, but Goebbels were introduced to the protocols through Henry Ford. Henry Ford's reach, international reach, had disastrous consequences and literally caused the deaths of millions.
Wow. Ford should read Rutherford's books.
And Rutherford, is pushing the same idea that the Jews, the big business Jews, the commercial Jews, are conspiring to take over the world. And those are the ones that are being controlled by Satan, and Jehovah would destroy at Armageddon. Rutherford's building his entire religion on these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that he also got from Ford and Bryan and the Populist Party. The Germans who used Ford's International Jew also wanted to know, were they true? And so there they burned trials, 1933 to 1937. And some of this is found in The Global Impact of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a century-old myth by Esther Wedman. So basically, the Nazis had a trial to try and find out if these protocols were true or not. In Bronner's book, A Rumor About the Jews, and he says that on May 14th, 1935, the verdict was delivered. The judge, Walter Meyer, was a practicing Christian who had never heard of the protocols. He found in favor of the plaintiffs, who was saying it was a forgery, and stated unambiguously that the pamphlet was plagiarized. He also considered it libelous in a form of smut literature that was incendiary and that deserved to be banned. The Nazis appealed, however, and a higher court found the definition of smut literature identical with sexual pornography under Swiss law. The Court of Appeals claimed that while the protocols may be obscene, it was not obscene in a pornographic sense. Thus, in November 1937, the earlier judgment was overturned for formal reasons, while it was confirmed that the protocols was a fabrication and smut literature in a general sense. So basically, the Nazis are stating that it was a fabrication. And when this is told to Adolf Hitler, even Adolf Hitler said, well,
maybe the general sense of it is true, even if it's proven a forgery. So the United States Congress,
Okay, I
the
was just going to
Russians,
say,
and the
so
Germans, the
in
Nazis.
summary, the Russians who created it, couldn't prove it to be true. Okay, then you go to Ford, who could not prove it to be true. Then you go to the Nazis, who used it as the whole basis of their master plan to wipe out the Jews. They could not prove it. The United States Congress had a trial on it, could not prove it. Okay, so there's no evidence of this. So Rutherford used it on his own initiative, and as we said before, built removing the Jews out of the Bible, out of their homeland, anti-Semitism. There's nothing there to show. The facts do not support the whole theory. Yeah, Jeff, comment some more.
The Russians couldn't prove it was true. The Tsar refused to use it because they couldn't prove it was true. The Nazis in their court couldn't prove it was true. Hitler admitted that it wasn't true. Goebbels admitted it wasn't true. Henry Ford admitted it wasn't true. The United States Congress admitted it wasn't true. Rutherford and the Watchtower admitted it wasn't true. And yet Rutherford and Watchtower are promoting these anti-Semitic ideas as the foundation of what he's teaching and creating his new Watchtower organization and religion out of.
In Crusade Against Christianity, which we've mentioned several times now in all of these discussions, this was the book that was written by the Golden Age editor, and it was talking about what the JWs were suffering under Nazi Germany, the persecution, the torture, the concentration camps. They were even smuggling out plans of the concentration camps to let people know what was going on. Of course, the book said a couple statements about the Jews. There was no sympathy about what the Jews or others were suffering in the camps. It was only about what was happening with the JWs. And it was only published in French, German, and Polish. So it hasn't been in English up until this point. When we were doing the research, there were several of these documents that we've had to translate from Nazi archives, the Crusade Against Christianity, Polish books, French books, German books, Russian materials, in order to pull all of this evidence together.
There's a lot of work involved in this presentation.
And so chapter 9 in Crusade Against Christianity has this statement about conspiracy. A conspiracy was organized to oppose the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, abolish freedom of conscience, make impossible the free proclamation of the truth, and exterminate the brave men who propagate the message. According to Bible prophecy, you had to expect such a conspiracy in the last days of Satan's rule that we have achieved, that we're at. While Christ was reigning in the midst of his enemies, Psalm 83 says, "Why did the nations conspire? Why did the peoples form futile plans? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers conspired together against the Lord and against his anointed." So what they're doing is saying there is a conspiracy against us because we're the spiritual Jews. Yeah, there's a Jewish world conspiracy. There's this and that, but it's all about us. We're the chosen ones. And so therefore, the persecution that we're suffering, the very fact that everyone's coming after us, proves verily that we are the chosen ones of God. We're the spiritual Jews, and that everyone else is going to die horribly in Armageddon.
So here you have it from a Jehovah Witness in the higher rank enough to be an editor of their magazines and publications, himself saying that according to Bible prophecy, you are to expect such conspiracies in the last days. I don't think he realized they were probably part of it when he wrote this. But I guess it's scripture fulfilling itself if you believe in the Bible. And again, he asked the questions: why do the nations conspire? Why do the people form these feudal plans? And that's what a lot of this is. It's a lot of how much time was spent on this. The Russians investigated it. The American Congress investigated it. The Nazis themselves, who used it as their sole tool to annihilate the Jews through this, investigated it. And again, what did it prove? Feudal.
But how does this all tie into Henry Ford and Rutherford's failed 1925 prediction? In looking up the origins of where Rutherford got these ideas from, we found a newspaper called The Fool Killer from North Carolina. And this is by James Larkin Pearson, who is considered one of the poet laureates of North Carolina. And in publishing this paper, he wrote some articles that were critical of Watchtower during the Russell period. Article with titles such as Russellism Roasted and Russell's Blessed Seed Wheat. In Larkin's autobiography, Poet's Progress, he mentions the studies in the scriptures and Charles Taze Russell in relation to some of his friends and relatives. He doesn't say very positive things about it, which is interesting because when you look at what he wrote in his paper after his negative articles, he became very positive towards Watchtower, towards Russell, and even Rutherford for some time after that. That is just completely left out of his autobiography. At the end of 1915, knowing Russell's predictions of the First World War, Larkin starts to question, what do you think of Russell? What if it turned out he was a true prophet? And following that, there are more positive articles about Watchtower, about the predictions, about the finished mystery, and so on and so forth. He even says in a short autobiography in his Fool Killer for April 1922, he says, I was once that same kind of a fool myself. I started out to denounce Russellism in this paper years ago. But the recoil from the first article was enough to open my eyes. I learned that I was butting into something bigger and better than I had ever seen before. I had been taught to believe that Charles T. Russell was a very wicked man and that his teachings were as dangerous as a rattlesnake. But I discovered, to my great surprise, that he was the safest, sanest theologian that has lived on earth since the days of the apostles. I saw that his system of teaching gave a reasonable and satisfying answer to all the difficult questions of theology that I had stumbled over for many years. So here's a very good example of how he became much more positive towards Russell, Rutherford, and Watchtower. Larkin was also a fan of Henry Ford. Being the poet laureate, he had even written poetry about Henry Ford in a couple of the issues. While in the April 1921 Fool Killer, he does have an article titled Henry Ford's False Alarm. But as time progresses, he starts to think about what Ford is saying. And so in the May 1921 Fool Killer, he has the Jew question again. And he's starting to think more like the way Watchtower is describing Henry Ford and the ideas as well in the early 1920s. Larkin says, the Jews are clear-brained and quick-witted. They could see plumb through a thing, while we Gentiles are getting our blamed eyes open. There is just one thing that the Jews have not seen yet, because the proper time has not come for them to see it. They have not been able to see that Jesus Christ was the true Messiah. They are being permitted to use their wits to conquer the world, and they are doing this while still in unbelief. Remember, this is similarly to how Watchtower is describing the Jews in this period. They separated in their heads this idea of the religious Jew being the ones that God is using, and then this business Jew, this commercial Jew, this international Jew, the unbelieving Jew being the ones that were plotting and conspiring to take over the world. And so Larkin is starting to head down that path. In the April 1922 Fool Killer, he has an article, Henry Ford is Different. And he says, Henry Ford is about the only millionaire on earth today that the common people have any respect for. All the knocking and abuse he gets comes from the other millionaires who are jealous of him. They used to poke fun at Henry, but he has grown and developed so fast in recent years that he has got the other poor little rich men thoroughly addled and bewildered. They don't know what move he's going to make next, and they don't know which way to jump to get out of his way. A little further down, it says, he has been a trailblazer for the new age, and the business world must learn to follow his steps. His influences on industry in general has been so great and so good that he has richly earned his billion. He has earned the respect and even the affection of the toiling masses. For no other man of great wealth has ever taken sides with the workers. Nobody will object if he gets 40 billions. I sometimes wish that he owned the whole bloomin' government, and I ain't so sure but what he will some of these days. He, like many others, were looking forward for Ford to get involved in politics. Some were suggesting Ford should get involved in Congress. Some suggested he even run for president. Even in the November 1921 Fool Killer, Larkin says similarly in an article, Sell Out to Henry. Larkin says, looky here. I move that we sell the whole doggone government to Henry and let him run it. I'll bet 5 cents he could do a better job of it than is now being done. In the July 1922 Fool Killer, he takes it a step further. Not only is Larkin at this time appreciating and admiring Russell, Watchtower, and Rutherford, he's starting to combine, as Watchtower was doing, suggestions that Henry Ford was making and his admiration for Ford with the prophecies and ideas that Rutherford and Watchtower was putting forth in these years, especially the 1925 date. So in the July 1922 Fool Killer, Larkin has an article, What About Henry? And in this article, Larkin says, something has got to be done with Henry Ford. He's getting to be such a power in the land that he can't be ignored much longer. And making fun of him won't work either. The people of these benighted states, whether they like it or not, have just got to reckon with the flivver man. A little bit further down, the peanut politicians are scared plumb out of their breeches for fear Ford will get into politics. But they ain't got sense enough to see that their fight against him on the Muscle Shoals matter is to be the surest way to put him into politics. A little further down. Okay, but Henry is ignorant, they say. He's unlearned. And he's not a professional politician. Yes, he's just ignorant enough to know that the way to do things is to do them and not talk forever about it. And a little bit of straight doing things is what we need in Washington right now. But the next question is, what party ticket will Henry run on if he runs at all? Neither of the old parties would dare to nominate him because they are all dominated by their own machine gangs, and they wouldn't touch a man like Ford with a 40-foot pole. Not even the Socialist Party would have him. And yet, 9 out of 10 of the common people of the country would be glad of a chance to vote for him. Looks like he'll have to run as an independent, or else a new party will have to be organized. Then he starts to talk about the 1925 date in relation to Henry Ford. Larkin says, thousands of Bible students are believing that the millennium will get into active operation by 1925. But any fool knows that no millennium can operate in this country while the government is in the hands of the old rotten political gangs that have been running it. So if prophecy is to come true, there must be a real change and a different kind of man put in the White House. Isn't it entirely reasonable and probable that Henry Ford might be that man? He certainly would be different. if that would do any good. If he should be elected in 1924, he would take office on March 4th, 1925, which seems to correspond exactly with the predicted time for the Golden Age to begin. Looks mighty nice, doesn't it? But there's one big ugly fly in the soup. That's Ford's anti-Jew propaganda. Seems to me that's one serious blunder he has made, and I'm afraid that blunder will keep him from being the man who is to lead us into the Golden Age. If there's any truth in the prophecy, the Jew is to be the head of things in the next age, and since Ford has seen fit to set himself squarely against the Jew, that makes everything look very uncertain. Maybe Henry will see his mistake in time to correct it. If he don't, then I'm afraid he will cause a serious hitch in the proceedings. Sure is a pity, but I can't help it.
Larkin is linking in the possibility of Henry Ford running for president. And Larkin suggests that if Ford would help save this country along with these prophecies in the Bible. And so Larkin is linking Rutherford's ideas with 1925, with the Jews, and Henry Ford all in one nice little package, and linking it all to Rutherford's 1925 date.
So technically, he got it before we did. Technically, he saw the connection. He didn't understand what it was, but he saw the connection for him to be making comments like that.
It's nice to see this linkage from another independent source. And so if you haven't seen our Watchtower secret newspaper discussion, one of our earlier discussions, go back and see that one. This would be another one. But if you look at Larkin's autobiography, he makes no mention of his ideas and thinking during this time period. He just skips over this time period. So it's very interesting.
Point in one's life.
But, unlike us, Larkin really believed these things, just like Ford did, just like Rutherford did, just like Hitler did. Which makes it even more depressing and scary,